In the quiet temples of ancient times, Buddhist monks discovered something remarkable. The peace we search for in 1,000 places is actually right here, closer than our next breath, waiting to be recognized. Before we journey together into these teachings, feel welcome to share what time it is where you are and where you are listening from tonight. Perhaps you are in a quiet room with the curtains drawn. Perhaps you can hear rain against the window or the distant sounds of the city settling into night. Wherever you are exactly where you need to be for this moment. Tonight, you will hear stories that have been carried through centuries, passed from teacher to student in moments of stillness, shared beside garden ponds and mountain paths, whispered in meditation halls where incense smoke curled toward wooden rafters. These stories are not meant to be puzzles you must solve or lessons you must memorize. They are gentle invitations to remember something you have always known but perhaps forgotten in the noise and hurry of daily life. The teachers who walked these paths before us understood that truth cannot be grasped through effort alone, cannot be captured by trying harder or thinking more. So tonight, there is nothing you need to do except listen. Let your body settle deeper into whatever is supporting you. Feel the weight of your head on the pillow, the softness of blankets around you. Let your breathing find its own natural rhythm, slow and easy, like waves finding their pace on a quiet shore. These teachings work best when you receive them the way a still lake receives moonlight, without resistance, without trying to hold on to every reflection. Some stories will resonate immediately, their meaning clear and bright. Others will simply move through you like wind through tall grass, doing their work in ways you may not notice until much later. There is no destination we are rushing toward, no achievement to unlock before sleep finds you. So take a moment now. Take a slow, deep breath that fills your lungs completely. Then release it with a gentle sigh. Feel yourself arriving more fully in this moment, in this space, in this particular night of your particular life. Let the concerns of the day begin to fade like stars fading into morning light. They will be there tomorrow if they need your attention. But tonight, they can rest, and you can rest. Let us begin this journey together into the wisdom that has sustained seekers for thousands of years. Wisdom about how to live with presence and peace, how to meet difficulty with grace, how to find stillness even when the world around us will not be still. These are not distant teachings from foreign lands. They are human teachings about the human heart, about your heart, about the capacity for peace that lives within you right now, waiting to be remembered. In a valley where morning mist gathered like soft clouds between the hills, there was a small tea house that sat beside a stream. The building was simple, made of wood that had darkened beautifully with age, its roof covered with moss on the northern side. Inside, the space was spare and elegant. A single scroll hung on the wall. A small alcove held a simple flower arrangement. The tatami mats were clean and smooth, showing the care of many years of attention. An old tea master named Akiko had kept this tea house for more than 40 years. She had come here as a young woman to study the way of tea, and she had never left. People said that to watch Akiko prepare tea was to witness something beyond technique, beyond skill. It was to see presence itself made visible through simple movements. Each gesture was complete, nothing hurried, nothing wasted, nothing added that was not necessary. One autumn afternoon, when leaves were just beginning to turn and the air carried a hint of the winter to come, a young man named Daichi arrived at the tea house. He was 24 years old, bright and ambitious, working in the city at a job that demanded long hours and constant attention. He had heard about Akiko from a friend who told him that learning tea ceremony might help with the stress and anxiety that had become his constant companions. Daichi arrived 15 minutes early for his appointment, which he considered appropriate. He was someone who prided himself on being prompt, efficient, always maximizing his time. While he waited in the small garden outside the tea house, he checked his phone repeatedly, responding to messages, reviewing his schedule for the coming week, his mind already racing ahead to everything that waited for him after this appointment. When Akiko finally appeared at the entrance and invited him in with a small bow, Daichi quickly put away his phone and followed her inside. The tea room was quieter than anywhere he had been in months. The only sound was the water in the stream outside and the gentle settling of the old building around them. Akiko gestured for him to sit, and he lowered himself onto the mat, already feeling impatient. He wanted to learn the ceremony, to understand the steps, to acquire this skill so he could check it off his list and perhaps gain the stress relief his friend had promised. Akiko knelt opposite him with a grace that made the movement look effortless, though Daichi could not have known the decades of practice that made such ease possible. She began to prepare the tea, and Daichi watched, trying to memorize the sequence of actions. First, she wiped the tea bowl with a silk cloth, her movements slow and deliberate. Then she measured the powdered green tea with a bamboo scoop, tapping it gently to release the powder into the bowl. She ladled hot water from the iron kettle, poured it over the tea, then whisked it with a bamboo whisk until foam appeared on the surface. Daichi observed all of this with his analytical mind, noting the steps, thinking about the technique. But he noticed something strange. Even though he was watching carefully, even though he was trying to pay attention, his mind kept wandering. He would find himself thinking about an email he needed to send, a meeting scheduled for tomorrow, a conversation he had had with a colleague that had not gone well. He kept having to pull his attention back to what Akiko was doing. Finally, she turned the bowl with precise movements and offered it to him with both hands. He took it, drank the tea quickly, and handed it back. It tasted bitter and grassy, not particularly pleasant to him. He wondered why people made such a fuss about this. Akiko looked at him with eyes that held both kindness and something else, perhaps a recognition of what she was seeing. She set the bowl down carefully. "Daichi," she said softly, "you were not here." He felt defensive immediately. "I was watching the whole time. I saw every step you took." "You were watching," she agreed, "but you were not here. Your eyes were in this room, but your mind was somewhere else. Perhaps in tomorrow, perhaps in yesterday, perhaps in the city and your work. But not here, not now, not with the tea." Daichi wanted to argue, but something in her gentle certainty stopped him. He realized she was right. He had been physically present but mentally absent, his attention scattered across a dozen different concerns. "The way of tea," Akiko continued, "is not about learning steps or mastering technique, though these things have their place. The way of tea is about learning to be completely present in this moment, with this water, this bowl, this tea. When you can bring your whole attention to this one simple act, then the act becomes complete. It becomes enough." Over the following weeks, Daichi returned to the tea house. Each time, Akiko would prepare tea with the same unhurried attention, and each time, Daichi would try to watch, to learn, to be present. But his mind resisted. It wanted to rush ahead, to finish, to move on to the next thing. The stillness of the tea room felt uncomfortable, almost painful. The slowness of each movement felt frustrating. One afternoon, after he had been coming for nearly a month, Akiko did something different. Instead of preparing the tea herself, she invited him to try. She guided him through each step, but every time he moved too quickly or with distraction, she would gently stop him. "Again," she would say quietly, "but this time, be with the cloth as you wipe the bowl. Feel the texture of the silk, the curve of the ceramic. Do not think about the next step. There is only this step." He would try again, wiping the bowl, and his hand would slow. He would begin to notice details he had never noticed before. The way the light caught the glaze on the bowl, the slight roughness of the ceramic under the smooth silk, the sound of cloth against clay. "Again," Akiko would say when he reached for the tea scoop too quickly. "The scoop is not trying to get somewhere. Let your hand move at the speed of presence, not the speed of hurry." Gradually, over many attempts, over many afternoons of practice, something began to shift in Daichi. The movements became less about completing a sequence and more about inhabiting each moment of the sequence. His breathing slowed, his shoulders dropped, The constant mental chatter that usually filled his mind began to quiet. One day, as he whisked the tea, he suddenly realized he had no idea how long he had been sitting there. Time had lost its usual quality. He was not waiting for this to be over so he could get to the next thing. He was simply here, with the whisk moving through the tea, with the sound of bamboo against ceramic, with the green foam rising in the bowl. For those moments, there was nothing else in the world but this. When he finally offered the bowl to Akiko, his hands were steady. She took it, drank, and smiled. "Now you are beginning to understand," she said. "The tea ceremony is not separate from life. It is teaching you how to live. Each moment can be met with this same complete attention. Walking can be done with presence. Eating can be done with presence. Even the work you do in the city, the work that brings you so much stress, can be done with presence." Daiichi felt something opening inside him, a space that had not been there before. "But how can I maintain this when I return to my life? Everything there is fast, demanding, constant. There is no room for slowness." Akiko set down the tea bowl. Presence is not about slowness or speed. It is about completeness. You can move quickly and still be present. You can work efficiently and still bring your whole attention to what you are doing. The question is not how fast or slow you move. The question is whether you are actually there for your own life or whether you are always somewhere else, always in the next moment, always thinking about what comes after this. She stood and walked to the small window that looked out on the stream. When you wash your hands, do you feel the water, or are you already thinking about the next thing? When you eat your lunch, do you taste the food? Or are you reviewing the morning and planning the afternoon? When someone speaks to you, do you hear them? Or are you preparing your response before they have finished speaking? Daiichi recognized himself in every question. He had been living his entire life at a distance. His attention always somewhere other than where his body was. Always in some other moment than the one he was actually experiencing. "The practice," Akiko said, turning back to face him, "is simple, but not easy. It is to notice when you are not present and to gently bring yourself back. Again and again and again. 10,000 times you will drift away into thought, into planning, into worry. And 10,000 times you can return. This returning is the practice. This is what the tea ceremony teaches." As the weeks turned into months, Daiichi continued his study. But something had fundamentally changed. The tea ceremony had become less about learning a skill and more about learning a way of being. When he returned to his work in the city, he began to experiment with bringing the same quality of attention he practiced in the tea room into his daily activities. When he felt overwhelmed by his tasks, he would pause and take 3 breaths, feeling each breath completely. When he was in a meeting, he practiced listening with his whole attention, not planning his response while others spoke. When he ate lunch, he would take at least the first 3 bites in complete silence, tasting the food, feeling its texture, being present to the simple act of nourishing his body. It did not eliminate his stress or make his demanding job easy. But something had shifted in his relationship to his experience. He was no longer constantly running ahead of himself, no longer living in a future that had not yet arrived. He was learning, slowly and imperfectly, to be where he was. One evening, after he had been studying with Akiko for nearly 6 months, he prepared tea for her. His movements had become smooth, natural, each gesture flowing into the next without his having to think about it. But more than that, he was present. His mind was not wandering. He was simply there, with the tea, with the bowl, with this moment that was complete in itself. When he offered the bowl to Akiko, she received it with a bow. She drank, and when she lowered the bowl, he saw that her eyes held warmth and something that might have been pride. "Now you understand," she said softly. "The ceremony is not the point. Presence is the point. And presence is available in every moment, not just when you are in a tea room, not just when conditions are perfect. Right now, as you sit here, this is it. This moment exactly as it is the only moment you actually have. To be fully here for it is the practice. To miss it because your mind is somewhere else is the human habit. But you can learn to come back. You can always come back. Daiichi bowed deeply, his forehead nearly touching the mat. He understood that what he had learned in this simple tea room would serve him for the rest of his life. Not because he had mastered a technique, but because he had begun to understand what it meant to be present for his own existence, to actually live the moments of his life rather than constantly being elsewhere. This teaching about presence through the tea ceremony speaks to something we all experience. We spend so much of our lives absent from our own experience, our minds scattered across past and future, our attention divided among countless concerns. We eat without tasting, walk without feeling, listen without hearing. We are physically present but mentally elsewhere, and in this way, we miss the only life we actually have, which is this moment, right now. The tea ceremony, as Akiko teaches it, is not about tea. It is about learning to bring our whole self to whatever we are doing, to inhabit our actions fully, to be undivided. This is not something we achieve once and then possess forever. It is something we practice, returning again and again when we notice we have drifted. In our modern lives, we are conditioned to value speed, efficiency, multitasking. We believe that doing many things at once is a strength, that being constantly busy is a virtue. But this way of living fractures our attention and exhausts our spirit. We are always doing the next thing, while only half doing the current thing. The practice of presence that Akiko embodies is revolutionary in its simplicity. It says that each moment deserves our complete attention, that washing a bowl can be as sacred as any ritual if we are fully present to it. That the ordinary moments of life, the ones we usually rush through or ignore, are actually the substance of our existence. When Daiichi learns to slow down enough to actually be present with the tea, he discovers that time itself changes quality. It is not that things take longer, it is that he is actually there for them. He stops living his life at a distance, stops being a tourist in his own experience. This is available to any of us, in any moment. When you notice that your mind has wandered, that you are thinking about something other than what you are actually doing, you can pause. You can take one breath and feel it completely. You can return to the simple sensory experience of this moment. The feeling of air on your skin, the sounds around you, the weight of your body, the fact of being alive right now. This returning is the practice. Not achieving some permanent state of presence, but simply noticing when we have drifted and choosing to come back, again and again. This is what the tea ceremony teaches. This is what every moment of life can teach us if we are willing to actually be there for it. In the mountains where ancient cedars grew so tall, their upper branches seemed to pierce the clouds, there was a monastery known for its practice of silent meditation. The monks there would sometimes sit for hours without moving, watching their minds with the same patient attention a fisherman watches the surface of a still pond. Among these monks was a young man named Kenji, who had arrived at the monastery 2 years earlier, seeking escape from a life that had felt increasingly hollow and meaningless. Kenji had been diligent in his practice. He meditated for many hours each day. He studied the teachings. He followed the schedule with precision. But despite all his effort, he felt frustrated. His mind remained chaotic, thoughts arising like an endless storm, never settling, never still. He had expected that by now, after 2 years of dedicated practice, his mind would be calmer, clearer, more peaceful. Instead, it seemed as turbulent as ever. The abbot of the monastery was an old monk named Renzo, perhaps 75 years old, with a face that showed deep peace and eyes that seemed to hold great depth without trying to. Renzo rarely spoke, but when he did, his words were simple and direct. One morning, after the early meditation session, Renzo approached Kenji and gestured for him to follow. They walked together from the meditation hall through the monastery grounds, past the vegetable gardens where other monks were already beginning the day's work, past the small graveyard where previous generations of practitioners had been laid to rest, and finally onto a narrow path that led into the forest surrounding the monastery. They walked in silence for perhaps 30 minutes, climbing gradually until they reached a place where several very old cedar trees grew in a small clearing. These trees were massive, their trunks wider than several men standing with arms linked, their bark thick and deeply furrowed. Renzo stopped at the base of the largest tree and placed his hand on the bark. "This tree," he said, his voice quiet in the forest stillness, "has stood here for more than 500 years. It was already old when this monastery was built. It has witnessed countless seasons, countless storms, countless years of growth so slow that no one could see it happening." Kenji stood waiting, unsure why the abbot had brought him here, or what he was supposed to learn from an old tree. Renzo seemed in no hurry to explain. He simply stood with his hand on the bark, as if listening to something only he could hear. Finally, Renzo turned to Kenji. "How does a tree this large grow from a seed smaller than your fingernail?" "Through time," Kenji answered. "Through years and years of slow, steady growth." "Yes," Renzo said. "And does the seed try to become a tree?" Kenji thought about this question. "No, I suppose it just grows according to its nature." "And does the young sapling compare itself to the fully grown tree and feel discouraged that it is not yet tall?" Kenji smiled slightly, beginning to sense where this teaching was leading. "No, it simply grows at its own pace." Renzo nodded. When this tree was young, it did not try to hurry its growth. It did not look at the older trees and feel it was failing because it was not yet as tall. It simply received the rain when rain came, received the sun when sun came, stood through storms, rested through winters, and grew according to its own nature and its own timing. He removed his hand from the tree and looked directly at Kenji. "You have been here 2 years, practicing with great effort, and you judge yourself harshly because your mind is not yet completely still. But tell me, how long has your mind been forming its patterns? How many years of conditioning, of habit, of learning to think and react in certain ways?" "All my life," Kenji admitted. 28 years of patterns. And you expect 2 years of practice to undo all of that? Renzo's voice was gentle, not mocking, just pointing to something Kenji had not seen. "You are like a young sapling, looking at an ancient tree and feeling discouraged that you are not yet 500 years old." Kenji felt something release in his chest. He realized he had been carrying an expectation that was completely unreasonable, that he had been comparing his beginning to someone else's maturity, his 2 years to another's lifetime. "But more than this," Renzo continued, "you have misunderstood what practice is. You think the goal is to make your mind still, to stop thoughts from arising, to achieve some perfect state of peace. But this is like the tree trying to stop the wind from blowing through its branches." He pointed up into the canopy far above them. Even now, on this relatively calm day, Kenji could see the highest branches moving, swaying gently in currents of air too high to feel from the ground. "Does the tree resist the wind?" Renzo asked. "No, it moves with it." "And does the movement of the branches disturb the roots?" Kenji looked at the massive base of the tree, solid and unmoved. "No, the roots remain stable even when the branches sway." "This is closer to what practice reveals," Renzo said. "Not a mind with no thoughts, but a recognition that you are like the depth of the tree. Thoughts arise like wind in the branches, sometimes gentle, sometimes stormy, but you are not the wind. You are not even the branches. You are the depth, the roots, the stable presence that observes all the movement without being disturbed by it." They sat down together at the base of the tree, their backs against the massive trunk. Above them, the branches whispered and creaked. Around them, the forest continued its endless patient life. Your practice, Renzo said, is not to achieve stillness in some future moment. Your practice is to recognize the stillness that is already present beneath all the movement. Right now, as we sit here, thoughts are arising in your mind. Yes? Kenji nodded. Even in this peaceful forest, his mind continued its activity. Thoughts about what Renzo was teaching, memories of his frustration, plans for how he would practice differently. And is there something aware of these thoughts? Renzo asked. Some capacity to observe them? Yes, Kenji said, recognizing what Renzo was pointing to. I can observe the thoughts. That which observes is still even when what it observes is in motion, Renzo said simply. The thoughts move like wind in branches, but the awareness of thoughts is like the deep roots of this tree, always present, always stable, never actually disturbed, no matter how much activity happens in the mind. They sat together for a long time. Kenji began to notice something he had never quite recognized before. His thoughts continued arising, but there was a quality of awareness that was simply witnessing them without being swept away by them. This awareness was not something he had to create or achieve. It was already present, had always been present, like the sky that is always there, even when covered by clouds. The young tree does not try to be old, Renzo said eventually. It simply grows, accepting each season as it comes. Some years bring abundant rain and rapid growth. Other years bring drought and the growth slows. The tree does not judge this. It simply lives, patient with its own process. He stood slowly, his old knees creaking. Your practice is the same. Some days your mind will be relatively quiet. Other days it will be stormy with thoughts and emotions. This is natural. This is not a problem to solve. The practice is to recognize that awareness itself is undisturbed by these weather patterns, just as the depth of the tree is undisturbed by wind in its branches. As they walked back to the monastery, Kenji felt different than when they had left. Something had fundamentally shifted in his understanding. He had been trying so hard to make his mind stop, to achieve some imagined state of perfect peace. But that effort itself had been creating tension, had been working against the natural process of growth and development. Over the following months, Kenji returned often to the grove of ancient cedars. He would sit with his back against the largest tree, practicing a different kind of attention. Instead of trying to force his mind to be still, he simply noticed. He noticed thoughts arising and passing. He noticed emotions moving through like weather. And he noticed the awareness that was observing all of this, the stillness that was present, even in the midst of internal activity. The interesting thing was that his mind did begin to settle, but not because he was forcing it. It settled naturally. The way silt settles in water when the water is left undisturbed. By not fighting against his thoughts, by not judging them as problems or signs of failure, they gradually lost their power to capture his complete attention. They became like the sound of wind in branches, present but not disturbing. One day, nearly a year after Renzo had first brought him to the cedar grove, Kenji sat in meditation and suddenly recognized something profound. The peace he had been seeking was not something to achieve in the future. It was not a state he would finally reach after enough practice. It was already present, had always been present, like the depth of the tree that remains undisturbed no matter what happens in the branches. He was that depth. The thoughts, emotions, and experiences were like the branches and leaves, constantly moving, constantly changing. But his essential nature, the awareness that witnessed all of this, was stable, unchanging, always peaceful in its depth. When he shared this recognition with Renzo, the old abbot smiled with genuine warmth. Now you are beginning to understand what the tree has been teaching. Growth happens according to its own timing, its own season. You cannot force it, but you can trust it. You can be patient with yourself the way the tree is patient with itself, growing at its own pace, not comparing itself to any other tree, simply being what it is in each season. This teaching about the patient growth of trees speaks to something we all need to hear. We are so conditioned to expect immediate results, quick transformation, rapid progress. We bring this expectation to our spiritual practice or our personal development. And then, we judge ourselves harshly when we do not see the changes we expect. But real growth is more like the growth of a tree than like building a house. A house can go up quickly through force and effort, but a tree grows slowly, mostly invisibly, following its own natural timing. Most of its important work happens underground, in the dark, where roots spread and deepen long before any new growth shows above the surface. Kenji's mistake was thinking that his practice should produce immediate, visible results. When it did not, he concluded he was failing. But Renzo helps him see that 2 years is barely the beginning, that the patterns of mind he is working with have been forming for decades, that transformation happens according to its own natural pace and cannot be forced. Even more importantly, Renzo points to a fundamental misunderstanding about what practice is for. Kenji thought the goal was to stop his thoughts, to make his mind still, but this is like trying to stop the wind from blowing through the tree's branches. The wind will blow, thoughts will arise. This is the nature of having a mind. The practice is not to achieve some perfect state with no thoughts. The practice is to recognize what remains stable, even when thoughts are moving. The awareness that observes thoughts is itself not a thought. It is like the depth of the tree, the roots and trunk that remain stable, even when the branches sway wildly in a storm. When we recognize this stable awareness as our true nature, we stop fighting against our experience. We stop judging our thoughts as problems or signs of spiritual failure. They become just thoughts, arising and passing, like wind moving through branches, and we rest in the depth, in the awareness that is always present, always peaceful, always undisturbed. This recognition does not come through effort or force. It comes through patience, through consistent practice, through being willing to grow at our own natural pace without comparison or judgment. Like the tree that does not compare itself to other trees, we can honor our own timing, our own season, trusting that growth is happening even when we cannot see it, even when it does not match our expectations. In a valley where 2 rivers met and became one, there was a village that had stood for countless generations. The people there lived simply, farming the fertile land, fishing the abundant waters, living in rhythm with the seasons. Between the village and the high mountains beyond, there was a deep gorge carved by centuries of water flow. On one side of this gorge lived the monks of a small monastery. On the other side lived the families of the village. For many years, the monks and villagers had lived essentially separate lives. The monks pursued their spiritual practice in silence and solitude. The villagers pursued their daily work, raising children, tending fields, going about the business of living. To travel from one side to the other required a full day's journey down into the gorge and back up the other side, so the two communities rarely interacted. A young monk named Sato had lived at the monastery for 3 years. He had come seeking liberation from the suffering of the world, seeking peace through detachment from worldly concerns. He meditated for many hours each day, studied the teachings of non-attachment, and devoted himself to spiritual development. He believed that true wisdom came from withdrawal from the world, from creating distance from the endless complications and suffering of ordinary life. But something troubled Sato, though he could not quite name it. His practice felt somehow incomplete, as if he were developing only one side of himself while another side remained dormant and unused. When he sat in meditation, he could touch states of great peace and clarity, but he also felt a growing sense of isolation, a feeling that perhaps he was hiding from life rather than truly engaging with it. The abbot of the monastery was a monk named Tenzin, who had lived there for nearly 50 years. Tenzin was unusual among the monks because he had not always lived in the monastery. He had spent 20 years living in the village as a carpenter before coming to monastic life. The other monks regarded him with great respect because he seemed to carry both worlds within him, both the contemplative depth of monastic practice and the practical wisdom of someone who had lived an ordinary life. One spring morning, Tenzin called Sato to his small room. "Sato," he said, "I have been observing your practice. You have developed good concentration, good stability in meditation, but I sense something is out of balance. You are developing the mountain, but neglecting the valley." Sato did not understand what the abbot meant. Mountain and valley? Tenzin stood and walked to the window that looked out toward the gorge. The mountain represents withdrawal, contemplation, the inward journey. This is what you have been cultivating. The valley represents engagement, action, the outward expression of wisdom in daily life. To be complete, a practitioner needs both. He turned back to face Sato. "I am giving you a task that will take many months, perhaps years. I want you to build a bridge across this gorge, connecting the monastery to the village." Sato felt surprise, confusion, and a kind of resistance rising in him. "A bridge? But I am not a carpenter or an engineer. I do not know how to build such a thing. And besides, I came here to practice meditation, not to build bridges." "Yes," Tenzin said simply. "That is precisely why I am asking you to do this. You came here to develop wisdom. Building this bridge will teach you something that meditation alone cannot." Over the following days, Sato struggled with this assignment. It seemed completely contrary to what he thought spiritual practice should be. He had come to the monastery to transcend worldly concerns, to focus on inner development. Building a bridge was worldly work, practical work, the kind of thing he had come here to get away from. But the abbot had given him this task, and his training required that he accept it. So he began to study. He traveled down into the village and found the old carpenters and builders, asking them about bridge construction. He learned about selecting timber, about calculating weight and stress, about how to anchor structures into rock. He studied the gorge itself, observing where the walls were most stable, where water had undermined the stone, where a bridge might safely span. The work was humbling. Sato had prided himself on his meditation practice, on his understanding of Buddhist philosophy. But here he was completely ignorant, having to learn basics from villagers who had never meditated a day in their lives, but who knew everything about working with wood and stone and the practical problems of construction. As he spent more time in the village, Sato began to see these people differently. He had thought of ordinary life as somehow spiritually inferior to monastic life. But he watched a mother caring for her sick child with a patience and devotion that matched anything he had seen in the monastery. He watched farmers working the land with a kind of mindfulness, completely present to their task. He saw old people facing death with an equanimity that required no philosophy, just a simple acceptance of what was. The bridge took shape slowly. Sato and a team of villagers who had volunteered to help worked for months, building the foundation, raising the supports, laying the deck. The work required total attention. A miscalculation could mean structural failure. A moment of distraction could mean injury. Sato found that he had to be completely present, his mind focused, his body and attention coordinated perfectly with the task at hand. Interestingly, he noticed that this work brought him into a state remarkably similar to meditation. When he was balancing on a beam high above the gorge, securing a rope, there was no room for his mind to wander. He was completely here, completely now, his awareness sharp and clear. The fear of falling kept him present in a way that sitting meditation sometimes did not. One afternoon, as they were working on the central span of the bridge, Sato paused to rest. He sat on the partially completed deck, his legs dangling over the edge, looking at the river far below. Tenzin had come to observe the progress, and he sat down beside Sato. "What are you learning?" the abbot asked simply. Sato was quiet for a moment, considering. "I am learning that I had a wrong understanding of practice. I thought wisdom meant withdrawing from the world, transcending ordinary life. But this work has shown me something different. The villagers I have been working with have their own wisdom. They may not sit in meditation, but they live with presence, with care, with attention. And this work of building the bridge requires the same kind of focus and awareness that meditation does, but applied in a different way. Tenzin nodded. The mountain and the valley are not separate. They are two aspects of the same path. On the mountain, in meditation, you develop clarity and depth. You touch something vast and peaceful. But if you stay only on the mountain, that clarity and peace never get tested, never get expressed in the world. They remain potential rather than actual. He pointed to the bridge taking shape beneath them. In the valley, in engaged action, you bring that clarity into expression. You serve, you work with others, you face the practical problems of life. This is where wisdom becomes real, where it gets embodied in action rather than remaining just an idea or an inner state. Sato understood more deeply now. So the bridge itself is a teaching. It connects the two sides, shows that they belong together. Yes, Tenzin said, and you are the bridge also. You are learning to hold both the inward journey and the outward expression, both contemplation and action, both being and doing. This is the complete path. The bridge took 2 years to complete. In that time, Sato was transformed in ways he could not have anticipated. His meditation deepened, but it was no longer separate from his life. The presence he cultivated on the cushion, he now brought to his work. The clarity he found in stillness, he now expressed in action. When the bridge was finally finished, strong and beautiful, spanning the gorge with elegant simplicity, the entire village and all the monks gathered for a ceremony. Sato stood at the center of the bridge, at the exact midpoint between monastery and village, between mountain and valley. He felt a completeness he had never felt before, a sense that the two halves of practice had finally integrated. Tenzin spoke to the gathered people. This bridge connects two shores, two communities that have lived separately for too long. But more than this, it represents the path of complete practice. We need both sides. We need the quiet of the monastery, where we cultivate wisdom. And we need the activity of the village, where we express that wisdom in service and engagement with life. He looked at Sato with warmth. This young monk came here seeking to escape the world. Instead, he has learned to embrace it. He has learned that true wisdom does not run away from life, but engages with it fully, bringing awareness and compassion to every action, every relationship, every practical task. In the years that followed, the bridge changed both communities. Monks would walk across to help in the village, offering teachings, but also working in the fields, caring for the sick, helping with harvest. Villagers would cross to the monastery for meditation instruction, for periods of retreat, for the peace that came from time in contemplation. The two ways of life, once separate, began to inform and enrich each other. Sato remained at the monastery, but he was no longer the same person who had arrived seeking escape. He had learned that practice is not about choosing between mountain and valley, between withdrawal and engagement. It is about developing the capacity to move between both, to cultivate depth in stillness and to express that depth in action, to be both contemplative and active, both peaceful and engaged. This teaching about the bridge between mountain and valley speaks to a split that many spiritual seekers experience. We sometimes think we must choose between spiritual practice and ordinary life, between meditation and action, between developing ourselves and serving others. But this is a false choice. The complete path requires both. The mountain, the monastery, the inward journey. This is essential. We need time for quiet, for reflection, for touching the depths of our own awareness. Without this, our action in the world can become scattered, driven by ego, lacking in wisdom. We need the mountain to remember who we are beneath our roles and identities, to access the peace that is our true nature. But if we stay only on the mountain, our wisdom remains theoretical. It never gets tested in the complexity of actual relationships, actual problems, actual life. It can become an escape, a way of avoiding the difficulties of being human. The valley, the village, the outward journey, this is where wisdom becomes real. When we bring the clarity we develop in meditation into our daily actions, when we express the peace we touch in stillness through how we treat others, when we take the insights from retreat and apply them to work and family and community, then practice becomes complete. We become like Sato's bridge, connecting the two shores, holding both aspects of the path. The interesting thing Sato discovers is that engagement with practical life, when done with full presence, is itself a form of meditation. Building the bridge required the same quality of attention he brought to sitting practice. Working with the villagers taught him things about patience, humility, and cooperation that he could never have learned sitting alone. This is the wisdom of the bridge. We are meant to move between mountain and valley, between being and doing, between cultivating inner peace and expressing that peace in the world. Neither side alone is complete. Together, they form a whole practice, a whole life, a path that honors both our need for depth and our capacity for engaged action in the world. As our time together continues, let yourself sink deeper into rest. These teachings are seeds that will grow in their own time. You do not need to understand everything, remember everything, analyze everything. Just let the stories wash over you like gentle waves, doing their work in ways you may not notice until much later. In a village where artists and craftspeople had worked for generations, there was a potter whose work was known throughout the region. Her name was Yuki, and people said that her pottery had a quality beyond mere skill, a presence that came from her complete attention to the work. Every bowl, every cup, every vase she created seemed to carry something of the stillness she brought to the process of making them. Yuki's studio sat at the edge of the village, a simple wooden structure with large windows that let in the northern light. At the center of the studio was her potter's wheel, an old wheel that had belonged to her teacher and her teacher's teacher before that. The wheel was perfectly balanced, its movements smooth and true from decades of use and care. A young woman named Hana came to apprentice with Yuki one spring. Hana was 22 years old, talented and ambitious, eager to master the craft and make a name for herself as a potter. She had studied at a prestigious art school in the city, where she had learned techniques and theories of ceramics. But she had heard that Yuki knew something that could not be taught in schools, something about the inner dimension of craft, and Hana wanted to learn this. On her first day in the studio, Hana watched as Yuki prepared to throw a bowl. The older woman moved without hurry, first wedging the clay to remove air bubbles, then placing it precisely at the center of the wheel. She wet her hands, started the wheel spinning, and began to open the clay. Hana watched the transformation closely, trying to memorize the technique. But what struck her most was not the movements themselves, but the quality of attention Yuki brought to them. The potter's entire being seemed focused on the clay, on the feeling of it beneath her hands, on the shape emerging from the spinning mass. There was no sense of her thinking about other things, no divided attention. She was completely present to this clay, this wheel, this moment of creation. When the bowl was complete, Yuki lifted it carefully from the wheel and placed it on a board to dry. Then she turned to Hana and smiled. "Now you try." Hana approached the wheel with confidence born from her years of training. She placed her clay on the wheel, wet her hands, and began to work. But immediately, things went wrong. The clay was not centered properly, so it wobbled as the wheel spun. When she tried to open it, the walls became uneven. She pressed harder, trying to correct the imbalance, and the clay collapsed. She tried again, and again the same thing happened. She could not understand it. She knew the techniques, She had thrown hundreds of pots in her training. But here, with Yuki watching, nothing was working. Yuki stopped the wheel and placed her hand gently on the ruined clay. "You are fighting," she said quietly. "The clay can feel it. And when you fight, the clay fights back." "But I am just trying to center it," Hana protested. "I know how to center clay." "You know the technique," Yuki agreed. "But technique alone is not enough. Come. Let me show you something." She took the clay off the wheel and reformed it into a ball. Then she placed it back at the center and started the wheel spinning. "Watch my hands," she said, "but more than that, feel what I am doing." Hana watched as Yuki's hands settled around the spinning clay. At first, the clay was off-center, wobbling slightly. But Yuki's hands did not force it. They simply held it with firm but gentle pressure, following its movement, and gradually, almost imperceptibly, the wobble began to decrease. The clay started spinning true, perfectly centered. "The secret of centering," Yuki said, her hands still holding the clay, "is not to force the clay to your will. It is to find where the center wants to be and help the clay discover that place. You listen with your hands. You feel the wobble and you gently guide the clay towards stillness. If you try to force it, you make it worse." She removed her hands and the clay spun perfectly. No wobble, no deviation. This is a teaching about more than clay. It is a teaching about how to work with anything in life. When you are centered, when you are balanced within yourself, you can help other things find their center. But when you are not centered, when you are tense and forcing, everything becomes difficult. Over the following weeks, Hana practiced centering clay again and again. At first, she found it almost impossible. Her mind would be thinking about the outcome she wanted, judging her performance, comparing herself to Yuki. This mental activity created tension in her body, and that tension prevented her from feeling what was happening with the clay. Yuki would watch and occasionally offer guidance. "Your shoulders are tight, let them drop. Your jaw is clenched, soften your face. Your breathing is shallow, breathe deeply into your belly." Gradually, Hana began to understand that centering the clay started with centering herself. When she was relaxed, present, breathing deeply, her hands could feel the subtle movements of the clay. She could sense where the wobble was and guide it gently towards stillness without force. One morning, something shifted. Hana placed the clay on the wheel, started it spinning, and her hands settled around it. For the first time, she was not thinking about centering it or trying to make it perfect. She was simply present, feeling the clay, breathing, allowing her hands to do what they knew how to do. And the clay centered. It found its balance, spun true. And from that centered place, she was able to open it and raise a bowl. When she lifted her hands and saw the bowl spinning perfectly on the wheel, she felt tears come to her eyes. It was not just about the clay. She had discovered something about herself, about how her own inner state affected everything she did. Yuki smiled when she saw what Hana had made. "Now you are beginning to understand. The wheel teaches us about finding center, but also about what happens when we lose it. Watch." She took a new piece of clay and placed it off-center on the wheel. When she started spinning, the clay wobbled wildly. This is like our minds when we are upset or distracted or caught up in strong emotions. Everything feels chaotic, out of balance. Then she placed her hands on the clay, and as before, she patiently guided it towards center until it spun true. And this is the practice of returning to center. We will lose our balance countless times in life. Things will throw us off center. Difficulty, loss, fear, anger, all of these push us away from our stable center. But we can always return. We can always bring ourselves back to balance. As the weeks turned into months, Hana deepened her understanding of this teaching. She noticed that some days she would come to the studio already off-center, her mind churning with worries or plans or reactions to things that had happened. On those days, her pottery work was difficult. The clay would not cooperate. Everything she made felt forced and lifeless. But Yuki taught her a practice. Before touching clay, before starting to work, Hana would sit beside the wheel for a few minutes. She would close her eyes and bring her attention to her breathing. She would notice where she was holding tension in her body and consciously release it. She would let her thoughts settle like mud settling in water. She would find her own center. Only after this would she approach the clay. And she found that when she began work from a centered place, everything flowed differently. The clay responded to her touch. The forms she created had life and presence. The work felt effortless, though it required complete attention. One day, Yuki gave her a more advanced lesson. You have learned to center yourself before work. Now you must learn to maintain center during work, even when things go wrong. She had Hana throw a pot and deliberately created a situation where the clay began to collapse. Do not stop, Yuki instructed. Stay centered within yourself. Feel what is happening with the clay, but do not lose your own balance. See if you can save it. Hana felt panic rising as the pot began to warp and collapse. Her instinct was to tighten up, to try forcefully to correct it, but she remembered the teaching. She took a breath, released the tension in her shoulders, found her center again. From that centered place, she could feel more clearly what the clay needed. She made a small adjustment, a gentle supporting of the wall, and the pot stabilized. It was not perfect, but she had saved it from complete collapse. Yes, Yuki said with approval. This is mastery, not never making mistakes or never facing difficulty, but being able to maintain your own center even when things are not going as planned. When you can stay balanced within yourself no matter what is happening externally, then you have real stability. As Hana's first year of apprenticeship drew to a close, Yuki invited her to create a piece for an important exhibition. Hana felt pressure immediately. This was a chance to demonstrate what she had learned, to show her skill. She wanted to create something impressive, something that would establish her reputation. She began planning an elaborate vase with a complex shape and intricate decoration. She spent days sketching designs, thinking about how to stand out, how to impress. When she finally sat down at the wheel to begin the piece, she was already tense, already off-center. The clay would not cooperate. After several failed attempts, she sat back, frustrated. Yuki had been working quietly at her own wheel. Now she stopped and came over to where Hana sat. You have lost your way, she said gently. You are not centered. You are thinking about outcomes, about impressing others, about your reputation. None of this has anything to do with the clay or the pot. It is all in your head, and it is pulling you off-center. Hana felt tears of frustration and recognition. Yuki was right. She had abandoned everything she had learned about presence and centering in her desire to achieve something. Start again, Yuki said. But this time, do not think about the exhibition or impressing anyone. Just sit with the clay. Find your center, and then let the pot be whatever it wants to be. Trust that when you work from a centered place, what emerges will be true and good. Hana took several days just to sit with the clay, without trying to make anything. She practiced finding her center again and again. She let go of her ambitious plans and her concern about the exhibition. She came back to the simple practice of being present with the clay, with the wheel, with this moment. When she finally began to work, she did not have a specific plan. She simply started with centering the clay, and from that centered clay, she began to raise a form. Her hands knew what to do. The shape that emerged was simple, elegant, and completely unforced. It was not elaborate or showy, but it had a presence, a quality of aliveness that came from her centered attention. When it was complete and had been fired, Yuki looked at it for a long time. This is real work, she said finally. This came from center. You can feel it. And this quality, this presence, is worth more than any amount of technical complexity or surface beauty. The piece was accepted into the exhibition. And while it was not the most elaborate or eye-catching piece there, people were drawn to it. They would stand before it for long moments, feeling something in it that they could not quite name, but that moved them. It carried Hana's centered attention, her presence, and people could feel that presence speaking to something in themselves. This teaching about the potter's wheel speaks to something universal. We all go off-center repeatedly in life. Stress, worry, fear, anger, desire, these emotions and countless others push us away from our natural balance. When we are off-center, everything becomes difficult. Our thoughts spin chaotically like clay wobbling on a wheel. Our actions are forced and ineffective. We feel scattered, fragmented, unable to access our own capacity for clarity and peace. But the practice is always available. Like the potter's hands gently guiding the clay towards center, we can guide ourselves back to balance. Not through force or self-judgment, but through patient attention, through noticing where we are holding tension and consciously releasing it, through returning our awareness to our breath, to our body, to the simple fact of being present right now. The centered place is always here. It is not something we need to create. It is our natural state, like the stillness at the center of the spinning wheel. When we find it, when we rest there, everything changes. Our actions become more effective. Our presence becomes palpable to others. We access a kind of wisdom that is not intellectual, but embodied, felt, lived. And when we lose center, as we inevitably will, we simply return, again and again. This returning is the practice, not achieving some permanent state of perfect balance, but developing the capacity to recognize when we are off-center and to bring ourselves back. This is a skill that serves us in every aspect of life, not just in pottery, but in relationships, in work, in how we meet difficulty and change. Let yourself rest now. Let your breathing settle into its own natural rhythm. Feel yourself finding your own center, that place of balance and stillness that is always present beneath the movement and activity of mind. Rest there. You are safe. You are held. All is well in this moment. In a monastery high in the mountains where winter lasted 6 months of the year, there lived a community of monks who practiced in conditions of deliberate simplicity. They owned almost nothing. Their robes were patched and mended countless times. They ate plain food. They slept on thin mats on wooden floors. To outsiders, their life might have seemed austere, even harsh, but those who lived there spoke of a deep contentment that came not from having much, but from needing little. Among these monks was a teacher named Ikkyu, who had lived at the monastery for 40 years. Ikkyu was responsible for training new monks, teaching them not just the philosophy of Buddhism, but the practical art of living with simplicity and appreciation. He was known for his unusual teaching methods, often using ordinary objects or everyday situations to point toward profound truths. One autumn, a young monk named Taro arrived at the monastery. Taro came from a wealthy family in the city. He had grown up surrounded by beautiful things, fine clothes, expensive tastes, but he had felt increasingly empty despite all his material comforts, and he had come to the monastery seeking something more meaningful than possessions could provide. In his first weeks at the monastery, Taro struggled with the sparse conditions. The food seemed bland compared to what he was used to. His simple robe felt rough against his skin. The small room where he slept seemed bare and cold compared to his comfortable bedroom at home. He tried not to complain, but Ikkyu noticed his dissatisfaction. One morning, after the early meditation session, Ikkyu invited Taro to his own small room. The space was tiny, barely large enough for 2 people to sit comfortably. There was a sleeping mat rolled in the corner, a small shelf with a few books, and in the alcove, a single object, a tea bowl. The bowl was old, clearly handmade, with an irregular shape and a rough glaze. It had a large crack running down one side that had been repaired with gold lacquer, making the break visible rather than hiding it. The repair was beautiful, the gold gleaming against the dark clay, but the bowl was obviously damaged, incomplete. Taro looked at the bowl, wondering why Ikkyu would display such a broken object. Surely even in a monastery of simplicity, one could find a bowl that was not cracked. Ikkyu noticed his expression and smiled. "You are wondering about the bowl," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, teacher. It is broken." "Is it?" Ikkyu reached up and carefully lifted the bowl from the alcove, handling it with obvious care and reverence. "Let me tell you about this bowl." He sat down and gestured for Taro to sit opposite him. "This bowl was made by my teacher, who made it with his own hands more than 50 years ago. For many years, it was perfect, whole, unblemished. He used it every day for his tea. Then one winter morning, the bowl slipped from his hands and fell onto the stone floor. It shattered into 7 pieces. Taro looked at the bowl more carefully now, seeing that indeed, the gold lacquer traced not just one crack, but several lines where pieces had been carefully rejoined. "Most people," Ikkyu continued, "would have thrown away the broken bowl. It was damaged, no longer perfect, no longer whole. What use is a broken bowl?" But my teacher did something different. He gathered every piece carefully. He took the bowl to a craftsman who practices the art of kintsugi, the art of repairing pottery with gold. Ikkyu turned the bowl slowly, letting the light catch the golden lines. The craftsman did not try to hide the breaks or pretend they had never happened. Instead, he made them beautiful. He used lacquer mixed with gold dust to join the pieces, so that the cracks themselves became part of the design, even more visible than before the bowl was broken. He handed the bowl to Taro, who took it carefully, feeling its weight, seeing how the gold catches the light, how the breaks had been transformed into something that added to, rather than subtracted from the bowl's beauty. When my teacher received the bowl back, repaired in this way, he said it had become more beautiful than when it was perfect. Before, it was just a good bowl, well made but ordinary. Now, it carried its history. You could see what it had endured. The breaks had been honored rather than hidden, and in that honoring, the bowl had gained depth, character, a kind of beauty it could never have had without being broken. Taro continued studying the bowl, beginning to sense where this teaching was leading, but not yet fully grasping it. "This bowl has been the most precious object in my life," Ikkyu said quietly. "Not because it is expensive or rare, but because it teaches me something I need to remember every day. It teaches me about wabi-sabi, about finding beauty in imperfection, about honoring the broken places rather than being ashamed of them." He took the bowl back and returned it carefully to its place in the alcove. "You come from a world that values perfection, newness, flawlessness. Things must be perfect or they are discarded. But this is an exhausting way to live, because everything breaks eventually. Everything ages, everything bears the marks of time and use. If we can only find beauty in the perfect and unblemished, we cut ourselves off from most of reality." Over the following weeks, Ikkyu taught Taro to look at the monastery differently. The patched robes were not signs of poverty, but marks of care, of refusing to discard something just because it was no longer new. The worn wooden floors showed the passage of countless feet over countless years, each scratch and dent part of the building's story. The simple food, prepared with attention and gratitude, had its own subtle flavors that could only be tasted when the palate was not overwhelmed by constant richness and complexity. One day, Ikkyu took Taro for a walk in the forest surrounding the monastery. It was late autumn, and most of the leaves had fallen. The trees stood bare, their branches stark against the grey sky. The ground was covered with fallen leaves, brown and curling, many of them torn or partially decomposed. "What do you see?" Ikkyu asked. "Trees that have lost their leaves," Taro replied. "The decay of autumn before winter comes." "Look again," Ikkyu said. "But this time, look with eyes that can appreciate wabi-sabi, eyes that can find beauty in the imperfect, the impermanent, the incomplete." Taro tried to shift his perception. As he looked more carefully, he began to notice details he had overlooked. The intricate pattern of bare branches against the sky, the subtle colors in the fallen leaves, not just brown, but shades of bronze and amber and rust. The way morning frost outlined each leaf with delicate crystal, the small mushrooms growing on fallen logs, finding life in decay. "Now you are beginning to see," Ikkyu said with approval. "Nothing here is perfect. Everything is in the process of change, of aging, of returning to earth. But this does not make it ugly. This is its own kind of beauty, the beauty of natural process, of authenticity, of things being exactly what they are without pretense." He picked up a fallen leaf, torn and partially eaten by insects, its edges curled and brown. In the city, in the world of perfectly maintained gardens and carefully controlled aesthetics, this leaf would be considered ugly, something to be swept away. But look at it truly. See the delicate veins, the way light passes through it. This leaf has lived its complete life. It has done what leaves do, and now it is returning to the earth to nourish new life. This is beautiful. This is honest. This is real. As winter approached and the conditions at the monastery became even more austere, Taro found his perspective shifting. He began to appreciate the rough warmth of his patched robe, seeing the stitching as marks of care rather than poverty. He began to taste the subtle flavors in simple food, finding satisfaction in warm rice and pickled vegetables. He began to feel the beauty of the bare, undecorated spaces, the way they allowed his mind to rest rather than being constantly stimulated. One morning, he discovered a crack in his own tea bowl, a simple bowl he had been given when he arrived. His first reaction was disappointment. The bowl was now damaged, no longer perfect. But then he remembered Ikkyu's teaching. He looked at the crack differently, seeing it not as damage, but as the bowl beginning to acquire its own history, its own character. He showed the bowl to Ikkyu. "My bowl has cracked," he said. "Should I have it repaired with gold?" Ikkyu examined the crack, running his finger along it gently. "That is for you to decide. But understand this. The crack does not make the bowl less valuable. It makes it uniquely yours. No other bowl will have this exact crack in this exact place. The bowl is becoming itself, distinctive, individual. You can have it repaired if you wish, or you can simply continue to use it as it is, letting the crack deepen and change over time. Either way, the crack is part of the bowl's story now." Taro decided to keep using the bowl without repair, at least for now. Each time he held it, he would feel the small crack beneath his fingers, and it would remind him of the teaching. Nothing is permanent. Everything changes and acquires marks of that change. This is not a problem. This is the nature of existence. As winter deepened and his first year at the monastery progressed, Taro found himself thinking often about wabi-sabi, about this aesthetic philosophy that found beauty in imperfection. He began to apply it not just to objects, but to himself. He had come to the monastery carrying shame about aspects of himself he considered flawed or damaged, mistakes he had made in his past, qualities he possessed that he thought were unacceptable, ways he had failed to live up to expectations. He had thought spiritual practice would help him fix these flaws, make himself perfect, finally become someone worthy of respect. But Ikkyu's teaching pointed to something different. What if his flaws were like the cracks in the tea bowl? What if they were not things to be ashamed of or hidden, but simply part of his human story? What if they could be honored, even appreciated, as marks of lived experience rather than signs of inadequacy? One evening, he shared these reflections with Ikkyu. The old teacher listened quietly, then nodded. "Yes, you are understanding the deeper teaching. Wabi-sabi is not just about appreciating imperfect objects. It is about accepting your own imperfect humanity. You have been broken in places. You have cracks. You bear marks of your life, your struggles, your failures. This does not make you less worthy. It makes you real." He stood and retrieved the precious repaired bowl from its alcove, holding it so the golden cracks caught the lamplight. My teacher used to say that only a broken bowl can be repaired with gold. The cracks are what make the gold possible. Without brokenness, there is no opportunity for this particular kind of beauty. Your own cracks, your own brokenness, these are not obstacles to awakening. They are part of the path. When you learn to stop hiding them, stop being ashamed of them, they become like these golden lines, visible parts of your story that add depth and character to who you are. This teaching stayed with Taro through all his years of practice. He learned to meet his own imperfections with less judgment, less need to present a perfect facade. He learned to see the beauty in weathered, worn, aged things, rather than always seeking the new and pristine. He learned that the most moving beauty often comes not from perfection, but from authenticity, from things and people that show honestly what they have lived through. The teaching of wabi-sabi, the beauty of imperfection, speaks to something we all need to hear. We live in a culture obsessed with perfection, with looking young and flawless, with hiding any sign of damage or aging or struggle. We are taught to present polished versions of ourselves, to hide our cracks, to feel ashamed of anything that does not match an impossible ideal. But this pursuit of perfection is exhausting and ultimately impossible. Everything breaks. Everyone ages. All of us carry marks of our lived experience, physical and emotional scars that show what we have endured. When we try to hide these marks, when we judge them as failures or flaws, we add suffering to the natural difficulties of existence. Ikkyu's bowl teaches something different. It shows that breaks can be honored rather than hidden, that imperfection can be a source of beauty rather than shame. The golden cracks draw the eye. They tell a story. They add depth and character that the perfect, unblemished bowl never had. In our own lives, our imperfections, our struggles, our broken places, these are not signs that we are unworthy or inadequate. They are evidence that we have lived, that we have dared enough to risk breaking, that we have survived difficulties and continued forward. When we learn to accept these aspects of ourselves with kindness rather than judgment, when we stop trying to present a perfect image and allow ourselves to be authentic and real, something remarkable happens. We become more human, more relatable, more genuinely beautiful than any pretense of perfection could ever make us. This is the wisdom of wabi-sabi, to find beauty in the imperfect, the impermanent, the incomplete, to honor the broken places in ourselves and in others, to recognize that cracks are not endings, but part of the ongoing story, and sometimes what seems like damage becomes the most beautiful part of who we are. As you rest now, perhaps you can bring to mind some aspect of yourself you have been judging as flawed or broken. Can you look at it with different eyes? Can you see it as part of your story, a golden crack that adds depth and character to who you are? Can you release, even slightly, the exhausting effort of trying to be perfect, and instead rest in the beauty of being real, being human, being yourself with all your imperfections? Let that possibility settle gently into your awareness as sleep draws closer. You are enough, exactly as you are. Your cracks are not failures. They are part of what makes you beautifully, authentically human.